Hello, beautiful soul. I'm Aurora, and welcome to Twin Flame Journey, a space where we explore the deeper meaning behind soul connections, divine timing, and the path that leads two hearts back to union. If you've been feeling the signs, you're in the right place.
Sometimes you know he's thinking about you before he says anything. Not because of magic. Not because of some perfect spiritual connection people romanticize online. But because something in your body shifts. You suddenly wake up at 17 in the morning for no reason. Your chest feels heavy all day, and you can't explain why. You start replaying a memory you hadn't thought about in months. His name almost slips out when someone asks you a completely unrelated question. And somewhere far away, he's sitting in his car outside a grocery store staring at a message he typed 3 times and still can't send. That's the part nobody talks about honestly. Because when a man really thinks about someone he tried to suppress, it doesn't always make him brave. Sometimes it makes him weird, quiet, avoidant, restless. Sometimes he misses her so much he becomes colder toward her. And honestly, that contradiction ruined my understanding of love for a long time. Because I used to think if someone cared, their behavior would look clear. Consistent, mature, direct. But real people are messier than that. Especially men who were taught to disconnect before they were taught how to stay emotionally present. This isn't about fantasy. It's about the strange, painfully human ways people haunt each other emotionally long after the conversation ends. And maybe you felt it too. The random emotional wave. The silence that somehow feels loud. The sudden urge to check your phone even while telling yourself you're over it. Maybe part of you already knows. Sometimes, when he's thinking about you, you feel it long before he admits it to himself. I don't think people talk honestly enough about how confusing this kind of connection actually feels in real life. Not the poetic version of it. Not the aesthetic version people post online with soft music and moon imagery and captions about energy never lies. I mean the uncomfortable version. The version where you're folding laundry, or sitting in traffic, or trying to answer a completely normal email, and suddenly something in you shifts so sharply it almost feels physical. And you don't even know why. Maybe that's the strangest part. It usually happens before the mind catches up. Your body notices first. You feel restless for no reason. Your chest tightens slightly. You keep checking your phone even though you already know there's nothing there. You reread old conversations you promised yourself you were done rereading. And the whole time you're arguing with yourself internally because part of you feels ridiculous. Like, no, stop, this is unhealthy. But another part of you goes strangely quiet. Because deep down it feels familiar. I remember one night specifically. Nothing dramatic happened. That's the weird thing. I was standing in my kitchen around midnight eating cereal straight out of the bowl because I was too tired to make actual food. The apartment was quiet except for the refrigerator humming and a dog barking somewhere outside every few minutes. And out of nowhere, I felt this wave of emotion hit me so suddenly I actually stopped chewing for a second. Not sadness exactly, more like emotional static. Like someone had opened a door somewhere inside me that I thought had already been closed. And immediately my brain tried to rationalize it. Maybe you're just tired. Maybe it's hormones. Maybe you're lonely. Maybe you just miss the idea of him. That last one used to annoy me the most. Because sometimes people say that to dismiss feelings they don't understand. You just miss the idea. Maybe. But sometimes you miss very specific things. The way someone paused before answering difficult questions. The nervous exhale they did when they were trying not to say too much. The way they looked emotionally overwhelmed after moments of closeness instead of relaxed. That's not fantasy. That's observation. And honestly, some of the strongest moments weren't even romantic moments. That's what confused me. It was tiny things. Him standing in my doorway one night looking like he wanted to say something vulnerable, and then suddenly talking about work instead. The way he'd pick up his phone during emotional conversations like he needed somewhere for his eyes to escape. How sometimes, after the deepest moments between us, he'd become quieter the next day instead of closer. At first, I thought that meant the feelings weren't real. Now, I think sometimes people pull away precisely because they are. Which is frustrating, immature sometimes, honestly, but human. There's this moment people rarely admit out loud. When someone affects you deeply, your body starts noticing them even in absence. And I know how crazy that sounds. Trust me, I argued with myself about it constantly. I still do sometimes. Because I never wanted to become the kind of person who romanticized every coincidence. I'm actually pretty skeptical by nature, but there were moments that felt too emotionally specific to ignore. Like waking up at 3 a.m. with this intense feeling that someone was thinking about you, then finding out later they almost reached out that night. Or suddenly replaying one exact memory for no reason after not thinking about it for months. Not the big memories either. Always the small ones. I once spent an entire evening unable to stop thinking about the way he laughed when he accidentally dropped ice cubes on the kitchen floor. That was it. Not a kiss. Not a declaration of love. Ice cubes. And somehow that memory carried more emotional weight than all the dramatic moments combined. Maybe because real attachment hides in ordinary details. I think people underestimate how much the nervous system remembers what the conscious mind tries to minimize. You can tell yourself you're detached. You can say you're moving on. You can even genuinely mean it. And then suddenly you hear someone with a vaguely similar voice in a grocery store and your stomach drops before your brain even understands why. That physical reaction can feel humiliating sometimes. Especially when you're trying to be logical. Especially when no actual communication is happening. And honestly, sometimes I hated how much silence could affect me. Because silence creates this weird psychological space where uncertainty grows. You start questioning yourself. Am I imagining this? Am I projecting? Why do I suddenly feel emotional today? And sometimes there's no clean answer. I think that's important to admit. Not every feeling is mystical. Not every emotional wave means something cosmic is happening. Sometimes your body is just processing unresolved attachment. Sometimes grief moves in cycles. Sometimes you miss someone at random because the human brain is strange and memory is deeply sensory. But sometimes there's also this undeniable feeling that someone is emotionally pulling at your mind from far away while pretending not to. And if you've experienced it, you know exactly how uncomfortable that sentence feels. Because it sounds dramatic when spoken out loud. Yet privately it feels embarrassingly real. Especially with emotionally avoidant men. And I don't mean that in a cruel way. I think some men genuinely care deeply and still become emotionally confusing because they don't know what to do with the intensity once it becomes real. So instead of moving closer, they hesitate. They disappear for a little while, then suddenly watch your stories within 30 seconds of posting, then vanish again, then come back with a random practical question that has absolutely nothing to do with what they actually feel. It's almost awkward how transparent it becomes once you've lived through it. I remember staring at my phone once after he reacted to an old photo I posted. Not even a direct message, just a reaction. And I physically rolled my eyes because part of me was irritated. Like, you can emotionally disappear for 2 weeks, but suddenly you're here because I posted a blurry sunset picture? But another part of me felt immediate warmth, which was the humiliating part. The contradiction. That's the kind of emotional honesty people usually leave out. Because healing narratives online often sound too clean. Real emotions are less evolved than people pretend. Sometimes you know someone is bad at expressing feelings, and you still crave their attention anyway. Sometimes you resent someone and miss them simultaneously. Sometimes you feel relieved they're gone, and then feel sad the moment they actually stop reaching for you. Human attachment is not spiritually elegant most of the time. It's messy, physical, contradictory. There is another thing I noticed too. Usually when he was thinking about me heavily, I'd feel emotionally distracted before anything external happened. Like my focus would fracture. I'd start doing small absent-minded things, opening apps without realizing it, walking into rooms and forgetting why I went there, checking my phone while actively telling myself not to check it. Almost like part of my attention was somewhere else emotionally. And maybe that sounds irrational. Maybe it is. But I've heard too many people describe the exact same thing in almost identical ways. Not in a mystical, weird, telepathically communicating way. More like two people emotionally lingering in each other's nervous systems longer than they expected. That feels more honest, more human. Because when someone impacts you deeply, they don't disappear cleanly. Parts of them remain in your routines. Your body remembers their timing. Your mind remembers their pauses. Your emotions remember the unfinished parts, especially the unfinished parts. I think unfinished emotions echo louder than completed ones sometimes. That's why certain people stay in your mind long after the relationship technically ended. Not because they were perfect. Usually they weren't. Sometimes they were emotionally immature. Sometimes inconsistent. Sometimes deeply caring and deeply unavailable at the exact same time, which is its own kind of heartbreak. And maybe that's why these emotional waves feel so strong. Because your mind keeps trying to solve something your heart already experienced, but never fully resolved. I don't know. Maybe I'm still trying to understand it too. But I do know this. There are moments when someone is thinking about you so intensely that somehow, before the message arrives, before the call, before anything tangible happens, you feel it. Not clearly, not perfectly, just enough to pause in the middle of your ordinary life and suddenly wonder why your chest feels heavier than it did 5 minutes ago. One of the hardest truths to accept is that sometimes a man can genuinely miss you while actively avoiding you at the exact same time. And I know how manipulative that sounds when you first hear it. Honestly, part of me used to hate that explanation because it felt too convenient, too easy. Like a way to excuse emotionally inconsistent behavior. Sometimes avoidance is exactly what it looks like. Disinterest, immaturity, emotional unavailability. But sometimes a man pulls away because being emotionally affected by someone scares him more than losing them does in the moment. That's the part people rarely explain properly. Because from the outside, his behavior looks cold, detached, maybe even cruel. Meanwhile, internally, he's thinking about her while standing in line at a gas station pretending to care about a bottle of water he's been holding for 5 straight minutes. He's replaying conversations while answering work emails. He's checking her profile at 1:12 a.m. with the brightness turned all the way down, like somehow that makes it less pathetic. And the weirdest part, half the time he doesn't even fully admit to himself that he misses her. He disguises it as curiosity, concern, habit, anything except the truth. I remember this one guy telling me he needed space. That phrase alone honestly irritates me now because of how emotionally loaded it became afterward. He said it carefully too, calmly, like he had rehearsed it in his head beforehand. I just need some space right now. And technically maybe he did. But what nobody talks about is what often happens after the space arrives. At first, there's relief. That's the uncomfortable truth. Relief. The emotional intensity settles down. The pressure disappears. Nobody's asking vulnerable questions anymore. Nobody's looking at him in ways that make him feel emotionally visible. And for a moment, he breathes easier. A lot of men confuse relief with certainty. That's important, because relief is immediate. Loss usually arrives later, quietly, in fragments. The first few days, he distracts himself pretty effectively. Work, gym, friends, scrolling mindlessly through videos while barely paying attention. Maybe he even acts unusually upbeat for a while. People around him think he's fine. He thinks he's fine. Then tiny things start leaking through. He hears a song she used to play in the car and suddenly can't focus on what his friend is saying. He picks up his phone to send her something stupid out of instinct, then remembers they're not talking. That moment is awful in a strangely specific way. Your body reaches before reality catches up. I don't think people realize how physical emotional habits become, especially after intimacy. Even small intimacy. Good morning texts, random photos during the day, sending links to things that only one specific person would understand. When that disappears suddenly, the silence feels disproportionate. Like something in the rhythm of daily life becomes uneven. And men don't always process that immediately. Some do. Some absolutely know what they're feeling. But others keep trying to outrun the feeling by becoming busier. There's something almost painful about watching a man emotionally avoid in real time when you know he cares. Because the behavior becomes contradictory in ways that make no sense unless you've lived it. He wants distance. Then he watches every story she posts. He ignores her message for 2 days. Then reacts instantly when she pulls away emotionally. He says he doesn't want anything serious. Then suddenly becomes visibly unsettled by the idea of her moving on. It's emotionally confusing because part of him is split down the middle. One side wants closeness. The other side associates closeness with loss of control. And honestly, some men were never taught how to emotionally regulate intimacy. They were taught how to pursue, how to perform confidence, how to stay distracted, but not how to sit inside vulnerable attachment without panicking. So when emotions become too real, they create distance before they even fully understand why. Then later the silence starts eating them alive. Not dramatically, not in movie scene ways, in ordinary ways. He's driving home at night and suddenly thinking about one sentence she said 3 months ago. He opens her chat thread without typing anything. He starts cleaning his apartment at midnight because emotionally he feels restless and doesn't know where to place the energy. I knew someone once who reorganized his entire kitchen after a breakup. Not because he cared about organization. He just couldn't calm down. That's what emotional suppression sometimes looks like in real life. Not poetic suffering, random productivity, restlessness, becoming weirdly obsessed with routines. Going to the gym twice a day. Anything to avoid sitting still long enough for the grief to become audible. And yes, I said grief. Even when he's the one who pulled away. Especially then, sometimes. Because there's guilt mixed into it now. That complicates everything. There's this specific kind of regret that happens when someone realizes they created distance from a person they actually wanted closeness with. But ego delays the realization. Fear delays it too. And pride absolutely delays it. So instead of directly saying, "I miss you," he starts orbiting emotionally. Watching, checking, hovering indirectly. He responds to stories instead of having real conversations. Sends random memes instead of saying what he actually feels. Finds practical excuses to reach out. How's your dog doing? You still going to that coffee place? tiny emotionally safe breadcrumbs. Meanwhile, the actual feeling underneath all of it is much heavier. And honestly, sometimes he hates himself a little for it. That's another thing people don't say enough. Men often feel ashamed of how emotionally affected they become, especially the ones who build their identity around appearing detached. Because once someone reaches them emotionally, their behavior starts exposing contradictions they can't control very well. Like checking her profile repeatedly after insisting he was done, or replaying her voice in his head while actively avoiding her messages, or feeling angry at her for becoming emotionally important to him. That one is uncomfortable, but real. Sometimes men resent the vulnerability they feel with someone precisely because the feelings are genuine, not because the woman did anything wrong, just because emotional dependence feels terrifying to them. There's a moment I remember so clearly. He had been distant for weeks. Cold, even. Not cruel exactly, just emotionally absent in that quiet, confusing way that makes you question your own instincts. Then, one night, he randomly sent a video of a street musician playing a song we used to listen to. No context, no explanation, just the video. I stared at my phone for almost a full minute because it felt so emotionally transparent and emotionally avoidant at the same time. Like, you miss me. Clearly. But you'd rather send a 3-second video than admit that directly. And honestly, part of me understood. That's the dangerous part. When you start understanding someone's emotional limitations, it becomes easier to excuse behaviors that still hurt you. So, I want to be careful here. Avoidance can be deeply painful for the person receiving it. And emotional confusion is not the same thing as emotional readiness. Sometimes a man misses you deeply and still cannot show up consistently. Both things can be true at once. That's what makes this kind of connection emotionally exhausting. The contradictions never fully settle. He says he wants space, then spends months mentally circling the connection anyway. He distances himself emotionally, then suddenly feels panic when the emotional cord weakens on your side too. And the strange thing is sometimes he doesn't fully realize how attached he is until he feels her emotionally letting go. That's when the silence changes. Before, the silence felt temporary. Now it feels real. And something in him reacts immediately. Not always maturely. Sometimes he reaches out impulsively. Sometimes indirectly. Sometimes through jealousy. Sometimes through nostalgia. And sometimes he does absolutely nothing externally while internally unraveling. That happens too. People assume feelings always create action. They don't. Not when fear is stronger than emotional courage. There's this internal dialogue I imagine happens more often than people realize. Do you miss her? Sometimes. That's not true. Long pause. Fine, all the time. Then why not call her? Another pause. Because this is where the truth usually lives. Not in wisdom. Not in spiritual language. Just uncomfortable honesty. Because if she answers like she's finally okay without me, I don't think I can handle hearing it. One of the most confusing experiences is watching someone become emotionally distant right after a moment that felt deeply real. Not before intimacy. After it. That contradiction can genuinely make you question your sanity if you've never experienced it before. Because logically, closeness is supposed to create more closeness. That's what most people expect. You open up to someone. You spend hours talking. You finally feel emotionally seen. You share vulnerable things you normally hide. And afterward you assume the connection will soften, deepen, stabilize. But sometimes with emotionally avoidant men, the exact opposite happens. The moment things become emotionally real, something inside them pulls backward almost automatically. And honestly, I don't think most of them even fully understand they're doing it while it's happening. That's what makes it so painful from both sides. I remember lying in bed once after one of the deepest conversations I'd ever had with someone. It wasn't dramatic. No crying. No movie scene confession. Just honesty. The kind that sneaks up on you slowly at 1:30 in the morning, when both people are too emotionally tired to keep pretending anymore. He told me things about himself he normally hid behind humor. Family stuff. Fear stuff. The kind of memories men often compress into one sentence because fully explaining them would crack something open emotionally. And I remember thinking afterward, oh, something shifted tonight. You can feel it when emotional walls move. Even slightly. The room feels different. The silence changes texture. People look at each other differently after vulnerability. And for a few hours, everything felt unusually calm between us. Safe, almost. Then the next day, he became distant. Not aggressively distant. That's what made it harder to explain. He still replied. Still technically communicated. But something had changed in his energy immediately after intimacy. His responses became shorter. He took longer to answer. There was this subtle emotional withdrawal happening underneath normal interaction. And if you've experienced this, you know how maddening it feels because the shift is small enough to make you doubt yourself. You start overanalyzing tiny details. Maybe he's just tired. Maybe work is stressful. Maybe I'm imagining this. Meanwhile, your body already knows something changed. That's the part people don't understand until they've lived it. Your nervous system notices emotional withdrawal before your mind fully processes it. You feel it in pauses, response timing, tone shifts, tiny absences. The warmth disappears first. And honestly, I used to take that behavior personally every single time. I thought emotional distance after intimacy meant the connection wasn't real. Now, I think sometimes it means the connection became too real too quickly for someone emotionally unequipped to handle it. Not always, but sometimes. There's this thing some men do after emotional closeness, where they instinctively try to regain internal control. Because intimacy affects them more deeply than they expected. And instead of leaning further into the feeling, they create space from it. It's almost like emotional recoil. Not because the intimacy was fake, because it mattered. That's the frustrating irony. I remember one guy holding me so tightly one night it felt almost unconscious, like his body was expressing something his words couldn't. Then, the following morning, he acted strangely detached over breakfast, talking about completely random things. Weather, traffic, protein powder. I remember sitting there thinking, what is happening right now? Because 6 hours earlier his forehead was against mine like he wanted to stay there forever. And now, he suddenly looked emotionally unavailable again. That emotional whiplash is deeply confusing when you don't understand avoidance patterns. Especially because the man himself often looks confused too. That's important. People imagine avoidant behavior as calculated manipulation all the time. Sometimes it is manipulative, yes. But sometimes it genuinely looks more like internal panic mixed with emotional suppression. Like someone touching a hot surface and instinctively pulling their hand back before they even consciously think about it. Real intimacy exposes people to loss, dependency, need. And for some men, those feelings trigger shame almost immediately. Especially men who were praised their whole lives for being independent, composed, unaffected. You can actually see the conflict happening in their behavior sometimes. They move toward closeness physically, then emotionally retreat afterward. They initiate vulnerability, then disappear for 2 days. They crave intimacy, then resent how emotionally destabilized it makes them feel. And honestly, some of them become colder specifically because they're trying to calm themselves down internally. That sounds terrible when you're on the receiving end of it, because from her perspective, it feels punishing. The more real the moment became, the colder he acted afterward. But internally, he may be trying to reduce emotional exposure before it consumes him completely. Not consciously, usually. More like a reflex. I remember this one tiny moment that explained everything better than any psychological theory ever could. We had spent an entire evening together laughing, talking, being unusually open with each other. At one point, he got quiet and just looked at me for a second too long. Not romantically dramatic, just emotionally exposed. Like he forgot to hide himself for a moment. And immediately afterward, he stood up and said he needed coffee. Not because he wanted coffee. I know that now. He needed interruption, distance, movement, something to break the emotional intensity before it reached a level he couldn't regulate anymore. That's what people often miss. Avoidance isn't always about escaping the other person. Sometimes it's about escaping the emotional experience happening inside themselves. And unfortunately, the person on the receiving end feels abandoned anyway, which creates its own painful cycle, because she starts becoming hyper-aware after intimacy too. She notices changes immediately. The delayed texts, the emotional flattening, the subtle detachment after closeness. And eventually she stops relaxing fully because part of her starts anticipating withdrawal every time things feel emotionally good. That's heartbreaking in such a quiet way, especially when neither person is entirely evil, just emotionally unequipped. There is another uncomfortable truth here too. Some men genuinely want intimacy right up until they receive it. That contradiction sounds absurd until you experience it firsthand. They crave connection while imagining it, long for closeness while chasing it. But once intimacy becomes emotionally real and consistent, fear enters the room. Now there's something to lose. Now someone can actually affect them. Now another person's absence could destabilize them emotionally. That realization changes everything, especially for men who associate emotional dependence with weakness. So instead of saying, "This closeness scares me because I care more than I expected," they unconsciously create emotional distance and call it needing space, confusion, stress, timing, pressure, or uncertainty. Sometimes they even believe those explanations themselves. That's the wild part. Avoidance can feel rational while it's happening. I remember one internal conversation I had after someone pulled away right after intimacy. He doesn't care. Are you sure? Yes. If he cared, he wouldn't act like this. Pause. Then this uncomfortable thought appeared in my head. Or maybe he cares, and that's exactly why he's acting like this. I hated that possibility, because it complicated everything. It would almost be easier if cold behavior always meant absence of feeling. But human beings are rarely that clean emotionally. Some people become softer when they fall deeper. Others become frightened. Others become emotionally inconsistent. And some become temporarily colder because vulnerability activates every unresolved thing they've spent years avoiding. Childhood shame, fear of rejection, fear of inadequacy, fear of losing control emotionally. The saddest part is that many men don't even have language for what's happening internally. So they default to distance, silence, distraction. I've seen men go emotionally numb after beautiful moments because the intimacy overwhelmed them faster than they could process it. Then later, much later sometimes, the feelings catch up all at once. That's when regret often enters. Delayed regret. The kind that arrives at 11 p.m. while sitting alone in a parked car or weeks of emotional avoidance. The kind where he suddenly misses her laugh so intensely it physically hurts for a second. The kind where he rereads old messages searching for the emotional closeness he himself became afraid of. And honestly, sometimes, by then she's already exhausted. That's the tragedy of it. Because emotional timing matters. You cannot repeatedly create emotional confusion and expect the other person to remain emotionally open forever. Even deeply understanding someone's wounds doesn't erase the impact of their behavior. That's important too. Compassion and self-abandonment are not the same thing. And I think some women stay stuck trying to decode emotionally avoidant behavior because part of them senses the love underneath it. The problem is sense love and receive love are not always experienced the same way emotionally. Someone can feel deeply for you internally and still fail to create emotional safety externally. That contradiction destroys people slowly, especially when the connection itself feels real. Maybe that's why these dynamics linger so painfully in memory. Not because the love was perfect. Usually it wasn't. But because both people kept touching something emotionally genuine and then losing each other inside their own unresolved reactions to it. Nobody warns you that after someone leaves, or half leaves, which honestly hurts worse sometimes, your mind won't replay the dramatic moments the most. Not usually. It replays the tiny ones. The embarrassingly ordinary ones. That's what stays. And I think that's why certain connections become so hard to fully let go of. Because the memories don't feel cinematic enough to categorize as heartbreak. They sneak into your life sideways. You're buying groceries and suddenly remembering the exact way he used to reach for things on the top shelf without asking if anyone else needed something too. You hear someone laugh in a restaurant and for half a second your body thinks it's her before logic cracks it. You remember the way she adjusted the passenger seat every single time she got into the car because she was short, but refused to admit she was short. Tiny things. Stupid things. But somehow those memories carry emotional weight far heavier than the grand declarations people think love is made of. I realized this one night while driving. Not dramatically, just driving home after a long day. It had rained earlier, and the road still had the reflective glow from streetlights bouncing off wet pavement. I was exhausted, the kind of exhausted where your thoughts become loose and unguarded. And out of nowhere, I remembered the way she used to hold coffee cups with both hands when she was cold. That was it. Not sex. Not I love you. Not a goodbye scene. Just her hands round a coffee cup. And the memory hit so hard I actually gripped the steering wheel tighter for a second. That scared me a little, because it made me realize how deeply the body stores people in fragments. Not complete stories. Fragments. The curve of someone's shoulder while they're asleep. The way they say hello differently when they're genuinely happy to hear your voice. How they stand in the kitchen when they think nobody's looking. People think attachment lives in major moments. I don't think that's true anymore. I think attachment lives in repetition. Tiny repeated experiences your nervous system quietly memorizes without permission. And men especially, they often don't realize how emotionally attached they are until those ordinary details start haunting them. Because big moments are easy to dismiss. You can rationalize intimacy. You can downplay emotional conversations. You can pretend something wasn't that serious. But you can't really explain why you suddenly miss the sound of someone dropping their keys on the counter after work. That's harder. That feels real in a way ego can't fully control. I knew a man once who forgot anniversaries constantly. Terrible with dates. But months after things ended, he still remembered the exact brand of tea she drank when she was anxious. That detail stayed with me because it revealed something uncomfortable. People often remember emotionally specific things long after they stop admitting they care, especially avoidant people. Because the emotional attachment leaks through sensory memory even while the conscious mind tries to suppress it. And honestly, sensory memory is brutal. Smell is probably the worst. Certain perfumes should honestly come with emotional warning labels. You'll think you're fine. Then, suddenly someone walks past you wearing something vaguely familiar and your entire chest changes. Not metaphorically. Physically. Your stomach tightens. Your breathing shifts. Your thoughts scatter for a second. And it feels ridiculous because the trigger itself is so small. But small things bypass logic faster. That's what makes them dangerous. I remember folding laundry once and finding an old shirt that still smelled faintly like someone I hadn't spoken to in months. And I just stood there holding it longer than necessary. Not crying. Not spiraling. Just paused. Like my body recognized something emotionally before my mind caught up. I think people underestimate how many relationships continue internally long after they end externally, especially when there were unresolved feelings involved. The mind keeps revisiting tiny moments, trying to emotionally complete something unfinished. That's why memories arrive randomly sometimes. Not because you're weak. Not because you're obsessed. Sometimes the brain genuinely revisits emotionally significant experiences when there was never a clean conclusion. And honestly, some men become unexpectedly emotional over details they would never admit out loud. Like the way she used to sing the wrong lyrics confidently, or how she'd touch his arm absent-mindedly while talking, or how she always stole fries even when she said she wasn't hungry. These things sound almost childish when spoken aloud, but that's exactly why they hurt. Because they're real, not curated, not poetic. Real intimacy lives inside unpolished details. I think that's also why emotionally avoidant men struggle so much after separation in ways nobody sees. Outwardly, they may look fine, still working, still joking around, still functioning normally. Meanwhile, internally, they're getting emotionally ambushed by completely random memories while standing in line at pharmacies or sitting at red lights. And they hate it. That's important. Some men genuinely hate how emotionally affected they become by small memories because it makes them feel vulnerable in ways they can't control, especially if they were the one who pulled away. Because now there's guilt attached to the nostalgia too. I remember someone once telling me, "I don't miss the relationship every day, I miss moments." That sentence felt painfully honest, because that's usually how it happens. You don't spend every waking second devastated. Life continues. You work. You eat. You answer emails. You laugh at stupid videos. Then suddenly you remember the exact way she looked at you one night when you were pretending to be okay. And now your chest hurts in the cereal aisle for absolutely no reason. Human emotions are humiliating sometimes. Especially delayed emotions. Especially masculine delayed emotions. Because many men suppress feelings in real time and process them later through memory instead. That's why the smallest details become emotionally radioactive afterward. The intimacy wasn't fully felt in the moment because part of him was busy managing fear, control, uncertainty, or emotional overload. But later the memory becomes clearer, sharper, almost cruelly sharp. He remembers the softness in her voice he ignored at the time, the effort she made, the pauses where she was quietly asking for reassurance without directly asking. And regret enters through details, not dramatic tragedies. Details. The way she waited for him to answer honestly. The way her expression changed slightly when he emotionally withdrew. The night she became quieter because she was tired of carrying the emotional weight alone. Men notice these things later sometimes. That's the heartbreaking part. Not because they're evil. Sometimes because emotional comprehension arrives too slowly. There's this internal dialogue I imagine happens during those moments. You should text her. No. Why? Because it's been too long now. Another silence. You still think about her though. Long pause. Yeah. And what do you think about? This is where people expect profound answers. But real answers are usually smaller. The way she used to fall asleep during movies. The sound she made when she laughed for real. The look on her face the last time I disappointed her. That's the stuff that stays. Not polished relationship milestones. Emotionally loaded fragments. And honestly, I think women feel this too, just differently. There's a specific kind of loneliness that comes from realizing someone probably remembers you in pieces now. Your coffee order. Your voice notes. The hoodie you always wore. Tiny surviving versions of you living inside someone else's memory. Even after communication stops. Even after pride takes over. Even after both people pretend they've moved on better than they actually have. Sometimes I wonder if unresolved love survives through sensory echoes more than anything else. Not grand passion. Echoes. Because certain people become attached to your daily rhythm in ways neither of you fully noticed while it was happening. Your timing. Your habits. Your presence. Then one day they're gone and the absence starts appearing in strange places. The empty side of the bed. The song you stop sending to each other. The silence after good news because you no longer know who to tell first. And eventually the smallest memories become the loudest because they were never performative to begin with. They were unconscious, which means they were probably real. Maybe that's why they linger so long. Not because the connection was perfect. Most aren't. But because somewhere between all the emotional confusion people accidentally memorized each other in ways the ordinary life keeps revealing long after the relationship changes shape. There's a specific kind of embarrassment that comes from realizing how often someone occupies your mind through a device you pretend not to care about. The phone becomes emotional evidence, not just of communication, but anticipation, avoidance, longing, ego, hope. And honestly, I think almost everyone lies about how much they check it after someone emotionally significant enters their life. Especially after distance starts growing. Because once communication becomes uncertain, the phone stops being a tool and starts becoming a psychological environment. You carry possibility in your pocket all day. That's exhausting. I remember reaching for my phone once before my eyes were even fully open in the morning. Pure reflex. And the worst part. The split-second disappointment after seeing no message happened before I consciously admitted I was hoping for one. That moment feels so small when you describe it out loud. But emotionally, it can ruin an entire morning if you're not careful. Especially when pride gets involved. Because then you start performing detachment for yourself. You put the phone face down. You tell yourself you're done checking. You become very dramatic internally about your closure. Then 10 minutes later you're unlocking the screen, again for absolutely no reason. Human beings are honestly pathetic when attachment gets activated. Especially emotionally avoidant people. Because they often participate in the exact same rituals while pretending they don't care nearly as much as they do. That contradiction creates so much emotional confusion between people. I knew someone who insisted he wasn't really on social media. Meanwhile, the man viewed every single story I posted within minutes. Every one. Silently. Consistently. Like clockwork. And it was strange because externally he acted emotionally distant. But digitally there was this constant quiet presence. Not enough to feel secure. Just enough to stay psychologically present. That's what makes these dynamics emotionally addictive sometimes. Intermittent attention. Tiny signs. Emotionally incomplete contact. You start analyzing microscopic interactions because the larger emotional conversation never fully happens. A like, a reaction, a story view, typing bubbles that disappear. Modern heartbreak is honestly insane when you think about it too long. People now have access to each other's existence without actual intimacy. That's dangerous, especially when feelings remain unresolved. Because the phone allows people to emotionally hover without fully showing up. And men do this all the time after pulling away emotionally. Not always intentionally. Sometimes they genuinely miss the person, but don't know how to re-enter emotionally without confronting vulnerability. So instead they linger indirectly, watching, checking, reading old conversations, opening profiles late at night when loneliness lowers their defenses. And yes, men reread old messages too. People don't talk about that enough. I think some women imagine men just move on cleanly and never revisit emotional memories once distance happens. That's not always true at all. Some men revisit conversations obsessively after separation because it's the safest way to feel closeness without risking rejection in real time. There's no uncertainty inside old messages. No possibility of being ignored. The conversation already happened. I remember someone once admitting he reread a specific conversation repeatedly because it was the last time things felt okay between us. That sentence stayed with me because it revealed something deeply human. Sometimes people use memory as emotional shelter, especially when the present feels emotionally inaccessible. And honestly, the phone becomes part of that shelter. There's this ritual people rarely admit out loud: opening someone's profile, looking for signs they're okay or not okay, checking if they posted something emotional, checking if they seem happier, checking if there's someone new, and pretending the entire time that it's casual curiosity. It's almost never casual, not when emotions are unresolved. I used to laugh at myself because I'd sometimes unlock my phone without consciously deciding to. Like my body was checking before my pride could stop it. That's what attachment does. It bypasses the polished version of yourself. You become emotionally repetitive in ways that feel irrational. And the really painful part is how quickly tiny interactions start carrying emotional weight. One delayed reply can trigger overthinking for hours. One random message can emotionally destabilize your entire day. One cold response after warmth can make your stomach physically tighten. People underestimate how physical uncertainty becomes, especially when emotional consistency disappears. And honestly, men experience this too, even when they act emotionally detached externally. I've seen men check their phones constantly after creating distance themselves. That contradiction is important, because sometimes the person who asked for space is struggling with the silence too. They just hide it differently. Women often process longing outwardly through emotion. Men often process it behaviorally. Restlessness, phone checking, random hovering, indirect contact. I knew a guy once who would intentionally wait hours before replying to someone he deeply cared about because he didn't want to look too eager. Meanwhile, he was checking his phone every 6 minutes waiting for her response. That's such a painfully masculine form of emotional self-sabotage. Performing emotional control while internally feeling completely emotionally hijacked. And honestly, some men become emotionally consumed by someone while simultaneously trying to appear unaffected by them. That internal split creates bizarre behavior. He opens the message immediately, then waits 3 hours to answer. He types something vulnerable, deletes it, types again, deletes again, eventually sends something emotionally neutral because it feels safer. Hope your week's going okay. When what he actually means is, I miss you in ways I don't fully know how to admit. But vulnerability feels exposing. especially after distance, especially after mistakes. So the communication becomes emotionally diluted, safer, smaller, and sometimes women feel this emotional reduction instinctively. You can feel when someone is restraining what they actually want to say. The energy becomes awkward, careful, almost overly controlled. I remember getting a message once that simply said, "Saw something today that reminded me of you." That was the whole text, and somehow it carried more emotional tension than paragraphs would have, because you could feel everything underneath it that wasn't being said. That's another thing about emotionally avoidant men. Sometimes the feelings leak through sideways, through implication, indirectness, half confessions, small emotionally loaded comments they hope you'll interpret without forcing them to become fully vulnerable. And honestly, sometimes women do interpret them correctly. That's why these connections become so psychologically consuming. Because both people are often communicating emotionally underneath the surface conversation. Through timing, attention, withdrawal, tiny digital behaviors. Even silence itself starts feeling communicative eventually. There's another humiliating ritual people rarely admit. The fake coincidence. Opening the app randomly the exact time you secretly hope they're online too. Posting something partially because you know they'll see it. Not directly for them, but not entirely unrelated to them either. People perform emotional proximity digitally now. And the worst part is both people are often doing it simultaneously while pretending they're not. I remember this internal conversation I had with myself once after checking someone's profile again. This is unhealthy. Probably. You need to stop. I know. Pause. Then why are you still doing it? And the answer came immediately. Because part of me still hopes they're emotionally looking for me too. That's the uncomfortable truth underneath most phone-checking rituals. Hope. Even tiny hope. Not always hope for reunion either. Sometimes just hope that the connection mattered equally. That you weren't alone inside the emotional intensity of it. That somewhere on the other side of the silence, another person is also staring at their phone wondering if reaching out would heal something or reopen everything. And honestly, sometimes men become quieter online precisely when they're feeling the most emotionally overwhelmed. That confuses people too. Because externally it looks like withdrawal. Internally it may actually be emotional flooding. He opens her profile, closes it immediately, opens it again 20 minutes later, types a message, deletes it, puts the phone down dramatically like he's finally done, then picks it back up before the screen even fully locks. It sounds ridiculous, because it is ridiculous. Human attachment is ridiculous sometimes, especially unresolved attachment, especially when pride and vulnerability start fighting each other internally. And eventually the phone itself becomes emotionally loaded. The notification sound changes your heartbeat slightly. The absence of notifications becomes emotionally noticeable too. You hate how much power something so small suddenly has over your emotional state. Yet there you are, checking again, pretending not to care again, thinking about them again. And maybe somewhere at the exact same time they're staring at your name on their screen too, trying to decide whether reaching out would bring relief. Or just expose how much they never stopped thinking about you in the first place. At some point, the silence stops feeling emotional and starts feeling physical. That's when you know the connection got deeper than either person wanted to admit. Because emotional silence is one thing. Physical silence is different. It settles into the body. You feel it in your chest while standing in line for coffee. In the strange heaviness of your apartment at night. In the way you suddenly can't focus on simple things anymore. And the frustrating part is how invisible it looks from the outside. People still go to work, still answer texts, still laugh at jokes. Meanwhile, internally, something feels completely off for them. I think men experience this in ways they rarely talk about honestly, especially emotionally avoidant men. Because at first, silence feels like relief to them. No emotional pressure, no vulnerability, no difficult conversations waiting in the notifications. Everything becomes quieter externally, but eventually that quiet starts turning against them. That's when the restlessness begins. And honestly, masculine restlessness after emotional loss is one of the saddest things to witness once you know what you're looking at. Because most of the time, it doesn't even look emotional at first. It looks productive. He starts going to the gym more, working longer hours, cleaning things obsessively, suddenly reorganizing his kitchen cabinets at midnight like his life depends on shelf spacing. I knew a man once who started running every night after things ended with someone he genuinely loved. Not jogging casually, running until his knees hurt. He framed it like self-improvement, health, discipline, focus. But if you watched him closely enough, it was obvious he was trying to outrun something emotionally. And honestly, I don't even think he fully knew that himself yet. That's the strange thing about emotional suppression. The body starts expressing what the mouth refuses to say. Restlessness becomes grief in disguise, and silence amplifies everything, especially at night. Nighttime is brutal for emotionally avoidant people because distraction weakens after dark. During the day, there's movement, noise, tasks, but at night, there's nowhere left to place the emotional energy. That's when people start pacing through apartments, opening apps repeatedly, standing in front of the refrigerator without actually being hungry, checking messages they already checked 6 times. I remember one night lying in bed staring at the ceiling after not speaking to someone for weeks. And what disturbed me wasn't sadness exactly. It was how aware I suddenly became of their absence inside my routine. The silence had shape now. I knew exactly when I normally would have heard from them. Exactly when my phone usually lit up. Exactly which parts of the day felt emotionally emptier. That awareness can make you feel slightly insane if you're not careful. Because nothing dramatic is technically happening. No argument. No active rejection. Just absence. But repeated absence changes the nervous system slowly, especially after emotional intimacy. I think people underestimate how quickly the human body adapts to emotional presence. Daily communication becomes part of your regulation. Certain voices become calming. Certain people become psychologically associated with safety, stimulation, comfort, familiarity. Then, suddenly, that contact disappears, and your body keeps expecting something that no longer arrives. That mismatch creates emotional static internally, especially for men who don't know how to process emotional dependency consciously. Because many men don't realize how attached they became until the routine disappears. That's when the silence becomes physical. He wakes up and instinctively reaches for his phone before remembering there's nothing to check. He hears good news and still thinks about texting her first. He sees something funny and experiences this brief emotional drop when he remembers the connection isn't active anymore. Tiny grief moments. That's what unresolved attachment actually looks like most of the time. Tiny grief moments scattered through ordinary life. And honestly, some men respond to this by becoming emotionally numb instead of emotional. That's important too. People expect heartbreak to look openly devastated. But masculine heartbreak often looks emotionally flattened, detached, tired, quiet in strange ways. I remember someone telling me after a breakup, "I don't even know what I'm feeling anymore. I just know everything feels kind of gray." That sentence felt incredibly honest to me. Because emotional overwhelm doesn't always create dramatic emotion. Sometimes it creates shutdown, especially in people who learned early in life that vulnerability feels unsafe. So instead of crying or reaching out, they become colder, more routine-driven, more isolated, and weirdly exhausted all the time. That exhaustion is real. Suppressing emotions takes physical energy. Your body stays tense constantly. Your nervous system remains alert underneath the numbness. Even sleep changes. Some people sleep too much after emotional loss. Others can't sleep properly at all. They wake up repeatedly, dream about the person, check their phone at 14 a.m. even though they know there won't be anything there. I think one of the loneliest experiences is realizing how much emotional space someone occupied after they're gone. Not because you consciously thought about them every second before. Actually, the opposite. They became integrated into your life quietly. That's why the silence feels so invasive afterward. It enters places you didn't even realize belonged to them emotionally. The drive home from work, Sunday mornings, certain songs, the 15-second pause before falling asleep. And men often try to fix this discomfort behaviorally instead of emotionally. That's where all the random productivity starts. Extra gym sessions, obsessive cleaning, sudden interest in work projects, late-night drives, anything that creates movement. Because movement feels safer than feeling. I remember this one guy who kept rearranging furniture in his apartment after someone left. At first it seemed harmless. Then eventually even he admitted, "I think I'm trying to make the place stop reminding me of her." That sentence stayed with me because it captured something painfully human. People physically alter environments trying to escape emotional memory. Move the chair, change the sheets, delete the photos, reorganize the room. Meanwhile, the emotional attachment remains completely untouched underneath all of it. And silence keeps leaking through anyway. That's the frustrating part. You can distract yourself temporarily, but unresolved emotions usually return in quieter moments. At red lights, in grocery stores, during long hours, while trying to fall asleep. Especially while trying to fall asleep. Because nighttime removes performance. There's nobody to impress at 1:47 a.m. Nobody to convince you're fine. That's when the truth usually surfaces. And sometimes the truth is embarrassingly simple. He misses her. Not abstractly. Specifically. Her voice. Her timing. The way she interrupted his overthinking. The comfort of her presence during ordinary moments. But emotionally avoidant men often experience another feeling mixed into the longing. Fear. Because missing someone means acknowledging emotional dependence. And for some men, dependence feels terrifying. So instead of reaching toward the connection, they freeze around it. This creates one of the most painful contradictions in human relationships. Wanting closeness while fearing the emotional exposure that comes with it. I imagine internal conversations like this happen constantly. Then why not just call her? Silence. Because hearing her voice would make this real. What's not real right now? Longer silence. That I actually lost someone important. That's the part avoidance tries to postpone. Reality. Because as long as communication remains unresolved, part of the connection still feels emotionally suspended. Hope survives inside ambiguity. But silence eventually becomes unbearable too. That's the trap. Too much closeness overwhelms him. Too much distance empties him. So he hovers somewhere in between emotionally. Checking her profile. Thinking about texting. Driving around at night replaying old conversations. Living inside emotional limbo while pretending externally that everything is under control. And honestly, some women feel this shift before contact even happens again. The emotional weight changes. The silence starts feeling louder somehow. You suddenly think about him more intensely after weeks of relative calm. Your body becomes restless too. And maybe that's coincidence. Maybe unresolved people simply linger psychologically longer than we want them to. Or maybe human beings affect each other more deeply than modern culture likes to admit. I don't know anymore. But I do know this. When someone is thinking about you heavily while trying not to, the silence changes first. You can feel it. Not clearly enough to explain. Not logically enough to prove. Just enough to notice that something inside you suddenly feels restless to well somewhere else. He's probably pacing through his apartment pretending he's just not tired yet. At first, he thinks the silence is temporary. That's the truth most people don't admit. Even after distance begins, even after the delayed replies, an emotional inconsistency and all the confusion part of him quietly assumes she'll still be there. Not consciously maybe, but emotionally. Like the connection exists, in some suspended state he can return to whenever he's finally ready. And honestly, that assumption lasts longer than people think. Especially for men who are used to emotional delay. Because internally, they often experience attachment in waves. One day, they feel overwhelmed and need distance. The next day, they miss her intensely. Then, they distract themselves again. Then, they circle back emotionally later. To them, the connection still feels alive because they're still emotionally inside it privately. What they fail to notice sometimes is that she's getting tired while all of this is happening. Quietly tired. Not dramatic. Not always angry either. That's the dangerous stage. When a woman stops arguing constantly and starts emotionally detaching instead. A lot of men miss the significance of that shift completely at first. Because externally, she may still respond politely. Still act normal. Still ask how his day was. But emotionally something subtle begins changing underneath. The warmth becomes more measured. The emotional reach shortens. She stops volunteering vulnerable things. Stops double texting. Stops trying to force emotional closeness from someone emotionally resisting it. And oddly enough, that's often when panic finally enters for him. Not because he suddenly starts caring. Usually he cared already. But now the emotional dynamic changes direction. Now he feels her absence emotionally too. I remember this happening so clearly once. For weeks, maybe months honestly, he had been emotionally inconsistent. Not cruel, just distant in that confusing half-present way emotionally avoidant people become. Some days warm. Some days detached, some days deeply attentive, then suddenly unreachable again. And eventually something inside me just slowed down. That's the only way I can describe it. I stopped checking my phone constantly, stopped rereading conversations, stopped emotionally chasing clarity from someone who clearly didn't know how to give it consistently. Not because I stopped loving him instantly. That's important. Detachment is usually much quieter than people imagine. Sometimes it's just exhaustion finally overpowering hope. And I remember the exact moment he noticed the shift. It was something incredibly small. I responded to one of his messages with simple politeness instead of emotional energy. That was it. No fight. No confrontation. Just emotional restraint. And somehow he felt it immediately. You could almost see the confusion enter the conversation. Suddenly he became more attentive again. More responsive. More emotionally available. Not fully, but noticeably. And honestly, part of me felt angry about that. Because where was this energy before? Why does emotional consistency arrive only after emotional distance appears on my side too? That contradiction hurts in such a specific way. especially because many women experience it. The moment they begin emotionally letting go, suddenly the man becomes emotionally activated again. And I don't think it's always manipulation. Sometimes it's fear finally becoming stronger than avoidance. Because emotionally avoidant people often don't fully process the possibility of loss until the connection stops feeling guaranteed. That's when reality enters. Before, her love felt emotionally available in the background. Now something changes. The emotional access feels unstable, and his nervous system reacts immediately. He notices she takes longer to reply now. He notices her energy feels calmer without him. He notices she no longer reaches for reassurance the same way. Tiny things suddenly become terrifying. I knew a man once who became emotionally panicked because a woman stopped sending him random updates about her day. Think about how small that is. No dramatic breakup speech. No betrayal. She simply stopped emotionally including him in ordinary moments. And he felt the loss instantly. Because inclusion is intimacy. People underestimate that. The small look at these messages. The random photos. The unnecessary conversations. That's emotional closeness. So when those things disappear, the silence changes shape. It stops feeling temporary. Now it feels like replacement is possible. That realization destabilizes a lot of emotionally avoidant men. Because suddenly the emotional safety net disappears. And regret starts becoming more specific. Not abstract longing anymore. Specific fear. Fear that she's genuinely moving on emotionally. Fear that someone else might receive the softness he kept mishandling. Fear that he waited too long to become emotionally honest. And honestly, masculine panic during this phase can look incredibly contradictory. He wants to reach out, but resents needing to. That's important. Because some men tie emotional pursuit to vulnerability. And vulnerability still feels threatening to them even while they're afraid of losing her. So, internally, they become divided. One side says, "Call her." The other side says, "If you call now, she'll know how much power she has over you." And ego enters the room immediately. Ego complicates everything during emotional attachment. Especially masculine ego. Not arrogance necessarily. Fear disguised as control. That's what ego often is underneath. Fear of emotional exposure. Fear of rejection. Fear of discovering it's too late. I remember someone once telling me, "I didn't realize how attached I was until she stopped reacting emotionally to me." That sentence haunted me a little, because it exposed something deeply human and deeply sad. Some people only recognize emotional security after it disappears. Not because they're evil, because familiarity numbed them to its value while it was still available. And honestly, women feel this to sometimes. But emotionally avoidant men especially seem to awaken when emotional access becomes uncertain. That's when the phone checking intensifies again. That's when old messages get reread. That's when random memories suddenly hit harder. Because now there's urgency attached to the attachment. I think this is also why some men suddenly become nostalgic at the exact moment a woman emotionally detaches. Not fake nostalgia either. Real emotional memory starts surfacing. He remembers things differently now. The way she cared for him quietly. The emotional effort she made. The patience she gave him while he remained emotionally conflicted. And guilt starts mixing with longing. That combination is brutal. Because now he's not only missing her, he's realizing how his own behavior contributed to losing emotional closeness with her. That realization arrives late for some men. Painfully late. I remember this one internal dialogue I imagined once during this phase. "She's pulling away." "No, she's not. She is." Pause. "She's just tired." Another pause. "That's worse." Because exhaustion changes relationships differently than anger does. Anger still contains emotional energy. Exhaustion often means someone has emotionally overextended for too long already. And emotionally avoidant men feel that shift instinctively once it happens. The emotional pursuit disappears. The emotional reassurance disappears. Now they're alone with their own feelings without her constantly stabilizing the connection emotionally. That's when panic can become strangely physical too. Suddenly he's checking her social media more, overanalyzing her tone, reading into silence the same way she used to. And there's almost poetic irony in that reversal. Now he's the one wondering, is she okay? Is she talking to someone else? Does she still think about me? Questions he avoided confronting earlier suddenly become consuming. And sometimes he tries to reconnect in emotionally awkward ways because direct vulnerability still feels terrifying. Random check-ins, old inside jokes, sending songs, reacting to stories after weeks of silence. Anything that creates emotional contact without fully admitting panic. But women often feel the energy underneath it by this point. You can tell when someone suddenly realizes your absence emotionally. Their timing changes. Their attention sharpens. The emotional inconsistency becomes mixed with urgency now. And honestly, that can create complicated feelings for her too. Because part of her still loves him, but another part feels deeply tired. That's the emotional tragedy of delayed awareness. Sometimes realization arrives after damage already accumulated quietly over time. Not dramatic damage. Small repeated emotional disappointments. Tiny moments of feeling emotionally alone inside the connection. And eventually something inside her protects itself by becoming less emotionally reachable. Not cold. Just careful now. That shift changes everything. Because once a woman emotionally stops waiting in the same way, the connection starts feeling real to him for the first time. Not fantasy. Not possibility. Not emotional convenience. Real potential loss. And some men finally confront their feelings in that moment. Others panic and retreat further. Others hover in emotional confusion for months. Human beings are messy like that. There's no clean formula for it. But I do think this is true. A man can spend a very long time suppressing his feelings while still assuming the connection remains emotionally available. Until one day, he feels her energy genuinely pulling back. And suddenly the silence he created himself becomes the very thing he can no longer tolerate. I think one of the most painful realities to accept is this. Someone can miss you deeply and still not reach out. Not because the feelings aren't real. Sometimes because the feelings are too real. And honestly, I used to hate hearing that. Because when you're the person sitting inside the silence, it feels insulting. If someone misses you, why disappear? If someone cares, why avoid? If the connection mattered, why leave everything emotionally unresolved? Those are fair questions. And sometimes there isn't a satisfying answer. That's the part people don't like admitting. Human behavior becomes irrational once fear and attachment start colliding, especially in emotionally avoidant men. Because a lot of them genuinely believe distance will calm the emotional intensity down. They think if they step back long enough, the feelings will reduce themselves naturally. And sometimes for a while they do, at least on the surface. That's the deceptive stage. He becomes functional again, gets busy, acts normal around friends, starts convincing himself he's finally getting over it. Meanwhile, emotionally, the connection is still active underneath everything, just buried. Then something small breaks the emotional suppression open again. Always something small. A song, a random memory, her name unexpectedly appearing somewhere. seeing someone who vaguely resembles her from behind. And suddenly the emotions return with embarrassing force. Not graceful emotions either. Messy ones. Confusing ones. The kind that make him stare at his phone for 20 straight minutes without doing anything. I remember someone telling me once, I thought I was moving on until I saw her favorite drink at a gas station, and my whole chest tightened. That's such a human sentence. Not profound. Not spiritual. Just painfully human. Because attachment rarely disappears in a straight line. Especially unresolved attachment. And honestly, emotionally avoidant men often experience longing in delayed waves. That's why their behavior becomes so contradictory. One week he feels emotionally detached. The next week he can't stop thinking about her. Then shame enters. Then avoidance returns. Then longing comes back stronger because now there's guilt mixed into it too. It becomes this exhausting internal cycle where he simultaneously wants emotional closeness and emotional escape. That contradiction is real. And people don't talk about how ugly it can feel internally. Because sometimes he genuinely misses her while also feeling irritated by how much space she still occupies in his mind. That's uncomfortable to admit. But emotionally overwhelmed people often resent the vulnerability they feel. Not the person necessarily. The dependence. The emotional exposure. The fact that someone can still affect them this deeply after distance already happened. I think some men especially were conditioned to associate emotional self-control with emotional absence. So when they continue missing someone long after the connection becomes complicated, they experience it almost like failure, weakness, loss of control, which makes them suppress harder, avoid harder, disappear harder. And unfortunately, that creates even more emotional damage externally. Because now she's left trying to understand how someone can seem emotionally absent while still emotionally attached underneath. That confusion destroys people slowly, especially intuitive women, because they often sense the emotional longing underneath the withdrawal. That's what keeps them emotionally stuck sometimes. Not fantasy. Contradiction. The behavior says one thing. The emotional undercurrent says another. I remember lying awake one night replaying this exact contradiction in my head. He misses you. Then why is he silent? Because he's scared. That's not enough. No, it isn't. That conversation felt important because both things were true simultaneously. Fear can explain behavior without excusing the damage it causes. I think people desperately want emotional experiences to fit into clean categories. If he loves you, he stays. If he leaves, he doesn't care. If he misses you, he reaches out. But real people are often emotionally less evolved than those simple rules. Some people deeply love others and still sabotage intimacy. Some people genuinely miss someone while actively avoiding contact. Some people feel overwhelming emotional connection and still choose silence because vulnerability terrifies them more than loneliness does temporarily. And honestly, some men avoid the woman they miss most because she triggers emotional honesty they can't comfortably maintain. That's the heartbreaking irony. The more emotionally significant she becomes, the more exposed he feels around her. She notices things. His emotional shifts. His contradictions. His avoidance patterns. That level of emotional visibility can feel unbearable for someone used to hiding behind control or detachment. So he pulls away. Not always consciously. Sometimes almost reflexively. And afterward, he spends months privately missing the exact closeness he ran from. That happens more than people realize. I knew a man once who admitted he used to open her chat thread almost every night without sending anything. Just reading old conversations. Sometimes scrolling all the way back to the beginning. Not because he didn't care, because he cared too much and didn't know what to do with it anymore. That distinction matters emotionally even if it doesn't change the outcome. Because internally he wasn't detached at all. He was emotionally trapped between longing and fear. And honestly, pride becomes a huge part of this dynamic too. Especially masculine pride. Not toxic alpha male nonsense necessarily. Just the fear of emotional rejection. The fear of discovering she no longer wants him. The fear that reaching out after creating distance will expose how emotionally affected he actually remained. So, instead of risking vulnerability, he stays silent and suffers privately, which is incredibly human and incredibly sad. There's this image I can't stop thinking about sometimes. A man sitting in his car at night outside his apartment after work. Engine off, phone in his hand, reading old messages, thinking about texting her, not texting her, and locking the phone again, typing, "I miss you," deleting it immediately, then sitting there another 20 minutes listening to music that suddenly sounds too emotionally specific. That scene feels more honest to me than most relationship advice online, because real emotional conflict rarely looks empowered. Usually it looks awkward, immature sometimes, emotionally messy, and unfortunately people can stay inside that emotional limbo for a very long time, especially if both people remain emotionally unresolved. Because silence creates fantasy eventually. He starts imagining conversations instead of having them, imagining her reactions instead of risking real ones. And imagined rejection often feels safer than actual vulnerability. That's the trap. Avoidance protects him from immediate emotional exposure while quietly intensifying the attachment underneath. And women feel this inconsistency deeply. That's important too, because being missed privately is not the same thing as being loved properly. Someone thinking about you constantly while failing to create emotional safety still hurts. Maybe even more. Because you can sense the feeling underneath the behavior, but never fully receive it in a stable form. That creates emotional confusion that lingers for years sometimes, especially when the connection itself felt emotionally rare. I think this is why certain people become impossible to fully forget. Not because everything was beautiful. Usually it wasn't. Usually, it was complicated and inconsistent and emotionally exhausting at times. But there was something undeniably real underneath all the dysfunction. And both people felt it. That's what makes it so hard. I remember another internal dialogue once that felt painfully accurate. "You loved her." "I know." "Then why did you disappear?" Long silence. Not dramatic silence. Just exhausted honesty finally arriving. "I don't fully know." That answer used to frustrate me. Now, I think sometimes it's the most honest answer emotionally avoidant people can give. Because many of them genuinely don't understand themselves in real time. They understand themselves retrospectively. After the silence. After the distance. After the loss becomes undeniable. That's when clarity arrives. Too late sometimes. And honestly, delayed clarity is one of the cruelest parts of human relationships. Realizing someone mattered after your fear already damaged the connection. Realizing the distance didn't protect you emotionally the way you thought it would. Realizing you still carry them everywhere internally anyway. In songs. In routines. In quiet moments. In the emotional reflex to tell them things that happened during your day. And maybe the saddest part is this. Some men spend years missing women they never learned how to stay emotionally present with. Not because the love wasn't there, because emotional courage wasn't. I don't fully know how to explain this chapter without sounding slightly unhinged. And honestly, maybe that's appropriate. Because some emotional experiences don't fit neatly into logic, but they also don't feel imaginary either. They exist in this uncomfortable middle space. Not mystical exactly. Not fully explainable either. Just deeply human. I think most people have experienced this at least once and then immediately tried to talk themselves out of it. You suddenly think about someone intensely after weeks of emotional quiet. Not casually. Sharply. Like your body remembers them before your mind consciously does. You're washing dishes, or answering emails, or standing in line somewhere completely ordinary, and out of nowhere your chest tightens slightly. A memory surfaces with strange emotional clarity. You feel restless, distracted, emotionally pulled somewhere you weren't planning to go. And immediately the rational part of your brain starts arguing. This means nothing. You're projecting. You're just lonely. Maybe. Sometimes that's true. I think it's important to say that. Not every emotional wave is some cosmic sign. Sometimes grief echoes randomly. Sometimes unresolved attachment resurfaces because the human nervous system stores emotional memory deeply. Sometimes your brain simply revisits unfinished emotional experiences because they were significant. That's real too. But there are also moments that feel almost too emotionally synchronized to dismiss completely. That's the part people whisper about privately, but rarely admit publicly because it sounds irrational when spoken out loud. I remember waking up once at exactly 3:04 in the morning with this overwhelming feeling that something was wrong emotionally. No reason, no nightmare, just instant emotional heaviness. And I tried to ignore it. Drank water, checked the time, rolled over, but the feeling stayed, like emotional static under my skin. The next morning, I found out he had almost called me that night after weeks of silence. And listen, logically, that could absolutely be coincidence. I know that. But emotionally, it felt strange enough to stay with me. Especially because this kind of thing happens more often than people admit. Not dramatic telepathy. Nothing cinematic. More like emotional echoes. To people who affected each other deeply, still reacting internally to the same emotional tension even while physically separated. That feels more honest to me than spiritual perfection. Because honestly, these moments rarely feel beautiful. Usually they feel uncomfortable, disruptive, emotionally inconvenient. You suddenly can't focus properly. You keep reaching for your phone. A random sadness appears in the middle of a perfectly normal day. And what makes it worse is that the feeling often arrives before conscious thought. That's the unsettling part. The body reacts first. I think women especially notice this because many women are hyper-aware of emotional shifts already. Tone changes. Energy changes. Emotional absence. So, when someone emotionally significant starts thinking about them intensely again, sometimes they feel the shift before actual contact happens. Not clearly enough to prove anything, just enough to disturb their emotional equilibrium slightly. I knew a woman once who said, "I can always tell when he's about to come back emotionally because I suddenly start dreaming about him again." And honestly, I understood exactly what she meant, even though part of me wanted to reject it intellectually. Because dreams after emotional attachment are strange. Someone you haven't consciously thought about in weeks suddenly appears vividly. Not fantasy versions either. Ordinary versions. Sitting beside you quietly. Looking at you without speaking. Repeating tiny moments from real life. And you wake up feeling emotionally disoriented for half the morning. I don't think the human mind fully understands emotional imprinting yet. That's the truth. People leave traces in each other psychologically, especially after emotional intimacy. Certain voices become internalized. Certain energies become familiar. Certain people become emotionally tied to your body's sense of comfort, anxiety, anticipation, longing. Then, when they start thinking about you heavily again, Whether consciously or unconsciously, something inside you sometimes reacts. Maybe because attachment itself never fully disappears cleanly. Maybe because human beings are more emotionally connected than we're comfortable admitting. Or maybe because once someone becomes part of your emotional patterning, your body notices shifts involving them instinctively. I don't know. I really don't. And I think pretending certainty about this stuff makes it sound fake. But uncertainty doesn't erase experience either. That's important. There were moments I knew something emotionally shifted before any external confirmation arrived. And I hated admitting that to myself because I'm not naturally mystical. I'm actually annoyingly logical most of the time. Yet there were moments that felt too specific emotionally to ignore completely. Like suddenly replaying one exact memory repeatedly out of nowhere. Then finding out later he had been rereading old conversations that same week. Or randomly feeling emotional heaviness during periods when he later admitted he was struggling mentally and thinking about me constantly. Again, maybe coincidence. But emotionally, it never felt entirely accidental. I think unresolved people remain emotionally entangled longer than modern culture likes to admit. Not spiritually superior, just psychologically unfinished. And unfinished emotions have a strange way of leaking across silence, especially when both people are suppressing things simultaneously. That's another part nobody talks about enough. Sometimes she feels him thinking about her because she never fully stopped carrying him emotionally either. The connection remains active underneath both people's routines. Quietly, which means certain emotional shifts affect both sides more than either person wants to admit. There's this particular kind of sadness that appears suddenly sometimes. Not dramatic heartbreak, more like emotional gravity. You feel heavier emotionally for no obvious reason. You start thinking about them during ordinary moments. And weirdly enough, your body starts behaving differently too. You check your phone more. Music sounds more emotionally loaded. You become distracted while doing simple tasks. I remember once standing in a grocery store staring at pasta sauce for an absurd amount of time because I suddenly got flooded with memories of someone cooking in my kitchen. Nothing even triggered it consciously. The feeling just arrived. Strong, immediate, physical, and honestly part of me became irritated. Because emotional memory feels intrusive sometimes. You want to move on logically while your nervous system keeps reopening emotional doors unexpectedly. That contradiction exhausts people, especially when no communication is happening externally. That's why some women become confused by these emotional waves. Because they think, if he's really thinking about me this much, why isn't he saying anything? That's a painful question. And unfortunately, people often think about each other far more than they communicate, especially emotionally avoidant people. Some men privately revisit the connection constantly while maintaining silence externally. That sounds insane until you understand fear. Because thinking about someone privately feels emotionally safer than risking real interaction. No rejection, no vulnerability, no loss of control, just internal longing. Which means sometimes she feels emotional movement before actual communication ever happens. The energy changes first. The silence becomes emotionally louder somehow. I remember this internal conversation one night while lying awake after suddenly thinking about someone intensely again. You need to stop romanticizing this. I'm trying. This probably means nothing. Maybe. Pause. Then why does it feel so specific? That's the part one still can't fully answer. Because emotional connections leave fingerprints on people. Not visible ones. Psychological ones. And maybe what we call feeling someone thinking about us is really just the body recognizing familiar emotional energy resurfacing internally. Maybe attachment itself creates emotional sensitivity between people long after separation. Or maybe some people simply become part of your internal world in ways that don't disappear cleanly with distance. Honestly, I think modern culture tries too hard to make every emotional experience either completely logical or completely mystical. But real human experiences usually live somewhere in between. Messy, uncertain, difficult to explain properly. And maybe that's why these moments feel so intimate. Because they happen privately. No audience. No validation. Just you suddenly sitting in your apartment feeling emotional pressure in your chest, while someone miles away might be staring at your old photos trying not to admit how much they still miss you. And maybe you'll never fully prove those moments are connected. Maybe you're not supposed to. But I do think this is true. When someone has loved you deeply, even imperfectly, even inconsistently, parts of them remain inside your emotional memory longer than logic can comfortably explain. And sometimes, late at night, in the middle of ordinary life, without warning at all, you feel them reaching for you emotionally before they ever find the courage to do it in reality. I think one of the hardest things to accept is that not every meaningful connection gets a clean ending. Some people leave dramatically. Some disappear slowly. Some stay emotionally present long after they physically leave. And some people never fully leave each other at all. Not completely. Even after the relationship changes shape. Even after time passes. Even after both people try very hard to become different versions of themselves. Parts remain. That used to bother me. Actually, no, that's too soft. It terrified me a little. Because I grew up believing emotions were supposed to resolve neatly if you were mature enough. You process. You heal. You move on. The end. But real attachment doesn't always behave that way. Especially when the connection was emotionally unfinished. And honestly, unfinished relationships linger differently than completed ones. There's no final emotional landing place. No clean moment where both people fully understood each other and peacefully let go. Instead, there are fragments. Missed timing. Fear. Avoidance. Love expressed too indirectly. Conversations that almost happened. Truths people realized too late. Those things echo, especially in quiet moments. I remember seeing someone again after a very long time once. Not a movie moment. No dramatic reunion. We were both standing awkwardly near the entrance of a coffee shop pretending to act normal. And what struck me wasn't romance. It was familiarity. The terrifying familiarity. The way my body recognized his presence before my thoughts fully organized themselves. The way his face softened for half a second before he remembered to emotionally regulate again. That's the part people don't explain properly. Certain people become physically familiar to your nervous system. Their voice, their timing, the emotional atmosphere around them. And even after distance, your body sometimes remembers before your mind catches up. That doesn't mean you're destined to be together forever. I think people romanticize that too much. Sometimes familiarity simply means history, emotional imprinting, human beings affecting each other deeply. That's all. But honestly, sometimes that's already enormous. I think some people spend years trying to intellectually dismiss connections their body already knows mattered. Not because the relationship was perfect. Usually it wasn't. Actually, the relationships that linger the longest are often emotionally messy. Beautiful in certain moments. Painful in others. Full of contradictions. One person reaching while the other retreats. Then reversing roles later. Timing issues. Emotional immaturity. Fear disguised as independence. All the painfully human things. And maybe that's why these connections stay alive internally. Because neither person ever fully relaxed into certainty. There is a strange ache to relationships where love existed, but emotional safety didn't fully develop at the same speed. You spend years wondering what the connection could have become if both people had been emotionally ready at the same time. That question alone keeps people emotionally attached longer than they admit. I remember once sitting alone at night thinking about someone I hadn't spoken to in months, maybe longer. And what hit me unexpectedly wasn't longing exactly. It was this weird realization. Some version of us will probably always exist inside each other. Not actively, not obsessively, just there. Like an emotional bookmark life never fully removed. That thought felt comforting and devastating at the same time. Because part of maturity is accepting that closure doesn't always arrive in the form we expect. Sometimes closure is simply learning how to carry unresolved feelings without letting them control your entire life anymore. And honestly, some people reconnect. That happens too. Sometimes enough time passes, enough self-awareness develops, enough emotional honesty finally breaks through the avoidance. People come back older, softer, more honest. I've seen that happen. But I've also seen people continue loving each other quietly from a distance because neither person ever fully figured out how to bridge the emotional gap between feeling and action. That happens far more than people admit, especially with emotionally avoidant men. Some men carry women in their hearts for years while never saying a word externally. Not because they forgot her, because shame, fear, pride, and regret became tangled together emotionally. And eventually the silence itself becomes harder to break than the original vulnerability ever was. That's the tragic part. The longer avoidance continues, the heavier re-entry feels. So he thinks about her privately instead, on random Tuesday nights, at red lights, during long drives home, while hearing songs he pretends don't affect him anymore. And somewhere else, maybe she feels it sometimes. Not constantly, not dramatically, just sudden emotional waves that arrive without warning. A memory while folding laundry, a dream that feels too vivid, a strange heaviness in the chest during otherwise normal days. Again, maybe coincidence. Or maybe human beings simply leave pieces of themselves inside each other more permanently than modern dating culture wants to admit. I don't know. But I do know this. Some connections continue emotionally long after communication stops. Not because people are weak, because emotional experiences shape the body, and bodies remember. I think women especially struggle with one painful question during these connections. If he thinks about me this much, why didn't he fight harder for me? That question hurts because sometimes there isn't a clean answer. Sometimes he genuinely lacked emotional courage. Sometimes he thought he had more time. Sometimes fear won. Sometimes he didn't fully understand the value of the connection until the distance became irreversible. And sometimes people simply love imperfectly. That's the uncomfortable truth underneath all of this. Love does not automatically create emotional maturity. It doesn't automatically create consistency either. Someone can feel deeply for you and still fail to show up properly. That contradiction destroys people emotionally because it feels unfair. Maybe it is unfair, but it's also real. There's another thing I think people eventually realize too. Being deeply thought about is not always the same thing as being deeply chosen. And that distinction matters. Because some women spend years sensing emotional attachment from emotionally unavailable men while never actually receiving stable love from them. That can become addictive emotionally, dangerously addictive, especially if the connection itself felt rare. So I want to say something carefully here. Just because someone misses you doesn't mean you're meant to wait forever. Just because someone thinks about you constantly doesn't mean they're emotionally ready to love you properly. Both things can hurt simultaneously. You can feel the connection and still recognize the inconsistency. You can understand someone's fear and still acknowledge the damage it caused. That's emotional maturity too. Not demonizing people. Not romanticizing them either. Just seeing them clearly. Human. Conflicted. Emotionally unfinished sometimes. I remember this imagined conversation once that stayed with me. Do you think he still thinks about her? Long pause. Yeah. How do you know? Another pause. Because people don't forget the ones who changed them emotionally. Silence. Even if they never say it. Especially then. Because some people express love openly. Others carry it privately for years like an old scar they touch when nobody's looking. And honestly, maybe that's why certain connections feel impossible to fully explain. They exist partly in memory, partly in longing, partly in unresolved emotional truth. Not every story gets closure. Some just become quieter over time. Softer, less consuming, but still emotionally alive in small hidden places. A song, a street corner, a late night thought, the reflex to check your phone when life hurts. And maybe that's okay. Maybe part of being human is accepting that some people permanently alter your emotional landscape without permanently staying in your life. That doesn't make the connection fake. It just makes it human. Messy. Incomplete. Real. And somewhere tonight, while you're trying to convince yourself you've finally stopped thinking about him, he's probably sitting alone in some ordinary moment, staring out a car window, scrolling past old messages, hearing your laugh inside a memory he never fully escaped, quietly convincing himself he isn't thinking about you either.
Thank you for spending this moment with me. If this message resonated with your soul, remember to subscribe and continue this journey with us here on Twin Flame Journey. And always remember, what is meant for your soul will always find its way back to you. Until next time, beautiful soul, trust the journey.